All right, guys, welcome back to Falcon Central. Host Aaron Freeman, joined by my co-host Scott Karasik. We are back this week to talk about the top five all-time Falcon players at offensive positions. We'll go position by position, going through our top five all-time Falcons. And of course, as usual, we will answer your mailbag questions. As you guys know, we usually start the show off by talking about the latest roster moves. There happened to be one roster move in the last 2 weeks. I don't know if Scott has very strong opinions about this one, but the Falcons did pick up an offensive tackle in Marquise Lucas to add to the multitude of the plethora of players that are competing to be the swing tackle, and they wound up cutting everybody's favorite former San Jose State Spartan, Christian Tago, the middle linebacker. Scott, do you have any takes on that?
They wanted another offensive line body for camp as opposed to another linebacker body for camp. And they did just sign Jack Lynn as well. So, that's the only thought I had. Jack Lynn is really replacing Christian Tago. And then they wanted to have another lineman because I think they cut a lineman. Robert Leff? So they just wanted to even it out because they always go into the offseason, into training camp with 15 or 16 offensive linemen and 8 linebackers. And that's where they're at right now. So they got the 3 deep on linebacker. They got when you include Ishmael, and then they've got a 3-ish deep on the offensive line. And I think they're going to have Alex Mack and Levitri not play as many snaps in training camp because, we know what they are and they're over 30.
Okay. All right. Well, that's much deeper than I thought you would go, Scott. I thought you would be who cares? But that's why you guys come here for, insight into the lowliest of roster moves. We'll see what happens with these guys in camp. I watched a little bit of Marquise Lucas when he was with, I think, Minnesota last year, if I'm not mistaken, in preseason. He's a body at this point. I don't necessarily know if he's going to shoot to the top of the totem pole in terms of competition, but we'll see what happens. And Tago, he seemed like a guy that could have made an impact on special teams, not necessarily being a high-level defensive player for the Falcons in terms of his future upside. So we'll see how it goes for these guys. And, we always talk about the roster moves at the top of the show because there's 3 of you, and I'm looking at you, Evan Birchfield, that really care about the in-depth analysis that we provide on even the lowliest of Falcons. So there's that for you. But let's move on and let's talk about the top 5 all-time Falcon positional rankings. All right, this week we're going to talk about the offensive players. We're just going to go position by position, quarterback, running back, etc., to list our top 5 guys in terms of all-time Falcon players. I think we did this once before, many, many years ago, so I think it's about time we do an update. I think maybe just our first year of doing the show, we did this. So, it's been about 3 or 4 years, so might as well update it. And then on our next show in 2 weeks, we'll do defensive players, and that will get us all ready for training camp because we got to fill the air with something. So, Scott, how do you want to do this? Do you want to go, each one of us go down our list, or do you want to go we each name 5 and then we go for, how do you want to do this?
I think we should come up with the list together.
Okay.
Because I feel that's the best way to do it. Because I've got one spot, I'm already looking at kind of your pre-rankings, and I've got a couple of guys where I'm I'd probably rank this guy a lot higher.
Okay. Okay.
So quarterback, I think we're both in 100% agreement about who number 1 is. Matt Ryan.
Yep. I don't know how much needs to be explained there, but I'll try. He has certainly stewarded the best era of Falcons football. He's been the most productive quarterback by far. It's not even close. And the team has been the most successful under him. This is really the golden age. The last 9 seasons have been, if you want to say it, has been the golden age of Falcons football, particularly in comparison to the previous 40 years of this franchise's existence. So, no doubt about it, Matt Ryan is the man. He's the best quarterback of all time. It's not even a conversation.
Yeah. And he already owns all the passing records in Falcons history. He's already done both what Michael Vick and Chris Chandler did and go to both a Super Bowl and go to an NFC title game. So, I mean, yeah, I'm with it.
There you go. All right, number 2, I think we both would agree here. It's probably Steve Bartkowski.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Before Michael Vick was around, Bartkowski was the guy that everybody was like, man, that's the best quarterback in Falcons history. And we thought Vick could have done it, but obviously the whole dogfighting thing kind of screwed everybody up.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I got Vick at number 3. And I think I would certainly make the case for Vick that even though he had a much shorter career, his peak, if you look at his 4 or 5 year peak in Atlanta, I would say that was better than any 4 or 5 years that Bartkowski have. But Bartkowski was the Falcons quarterback for 11 seasons. And even though, he didn't have quite the peak, in the middle of that, in the late 70s, early 80s, he was a pretty good quarterback for the Falcons. And you take those 4 or 5 years in the peak of his seasons, compare them to Vick's. Vick's comes out better. But the fact that Bartkowski has an additional 6 or 7 years on his career that Vick never had, obviously because Scott said because of the dogfighting stuff and going to jail and all that stuff, it gives Bartkowski the edge in that sort of that conversation. So I would go Bartkowski 2, Vick number 3.
I completely agree there. Now, after is where I kind of have a little bit of a quibble.
Okay.
I've never seen Bob Berry play. I have seen Chris Miller play. And I have seen Chris Chandler play. And I think in terms of pure quarterback skill, I'm going to rate Chris Miller over Chris Chandler 9 times out of 10. The team wasn't as successful, but the team also had the worst roster in the NFL. Like the Falcons were the Browns in those years. And Chris Miller still was doing a good job. So I'm going to personally say that I think Chris Miller is a better quarterback than Bob Berry was. And I think he's a better quarterback than Chris Chandler was. And I think if he had been given the same weapons Chris Chandler was given, Atlanta would have gone just as far with him as they did Chris Chandler back in '98.
That's a fair statement.
I mean, especially since that team was defense and running game oriented and it had the deep pass, Miller was actually a better deep passer than Chandler was.
That's fair. Originally I sort of had Chris Miller 5 because I think that's sort of the consensus that most people tend to have. I know Blog and Dirty had a top 5 Falcon or a top 10 Falcons quarterback that they published this week or something, and they had Chandler 4 and Miller 5. And originally that was sort of what I was going to go for. But I did a little bit more research. And while Miller was the quarterback of the Falcons when I first became a fan, and so, he was sort of the guy, I think Miller, he was productive, but the team was particularly bad when he was here. And on an individual level, I just don't know if sort of his production sort of stands the test of time. You can make the argument that Bobby Hebert in the year or two that he wound up replacing Chris Miller as the starter when Miller got hurt, that he was kind of better than Chris Miller. So I feel like Chris Miller gets a little bit of a bump that probably is undeserved. And I wanted to throw a bone to a guy like Bob Berry, who did play before my time. I'm not that old. But it is one of those things where going back and doing a little bit of research, he was the quarterback of the team when they first had their first sort of winning season. He was the first Falcon quarterback to make the Pro Bowl in 1969. And you look at some of his production, at least relative to his era, he was one of the more productive quarterbacks in his era. The one thing that really stands out for him was how horrible his offensive lines were. And if you extrapolated how many times he got sacked during, sort of those years in Atlanta, and you extrapolated it to today, it would be the equivalent of a quarterback today getting sacked 80 times in a season. So it's like, David Carr where his rookie season, I think at Houston, he was sacked like 75 times. And so I think Bob Berry, to be as productive as he was at a time when those weren't good Falcon teams, and despite having probably the worst offensive line in the league, like it's the equivalent of the lines Teddy Bridgewater has been forced to play behind in Minnesota. And it's similar. Like I would make the comparison between Bob Berry and Teddy Bridgewater, not necessarily maybe in playing style, but at least in terms of doing a lot with very little. So I'll give Bob Berry throw him a bone and put him 5th on that list. I like Chandler at 4. Obviously, I think he was a good veteran quarterback, not as sort of skillful as Desire, but you can't dismiss the success that he had in 1998. When everything was sort of clicking for him and he was able to operate the type of offense that he needed to, which was a run-heavy, play-action-based offense, not too dissimilar to the offense Matt Ryan operated this past year, and you see the production. So I can't penalize Chris Chandler if I'm not going to penalize Matt Ryan. So that's how I would sort of frame it.
Well, and Chandler had went to the Pro Bowl the year before, too.
Yeah. Chandler had some good years, played on some bad Falcon teams, similar to Chris Miller, but I think he did a lot more with less than some of the other Falcon quarterbacks had. But it's really like it's a 4-man race, and then it's like Chris Miller, Bob Berry, maybe some people might have Bobby Hebert there. I don't know. Not sure who else you would put 5th, but it's like 4 guys, and then you got to name another guy, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'd personally put Miller there, but let's move on. I think running back's going to be a little more interesting.
Okay. Who do you think is the best running back of all time?
In Falcons history?
Yeah.
Don't give me shit for this one. I'm going to say it's Warrick Dunn.
Okay. I think you can answer this question in a multitude of ways. You can rank, I think there's 5 guys that you can put in your top 5 that are definitely in the top 5 consensus, but if you could literally shuffle them up and rank them any way you want, and I wouldn't have a problem.
Yeah, so like Gerald Riggs, Michael Turner, William Andrews, Warrick Dunn, Jamal Anderson, those are the top 5 guys.
Yeah.
The order that we have them is going to be what kind of determines it. I think as an all-around threat, Warrick Dunn was the best running back in Falcons history. And he was very good about not fumbling the ball, which that's important to me. I think number 2 is Michael Turner because he had the highest peaks. And then I'd say 3 is Jamal Anderson because the same kind of thing that you say with Warrick Dunn, Anderson was a good receiver at the backfield too. And then I'd go Riggs, and then I'd go Andrews. And I know that sounds crazy because like Riggs and Andrews are Ring of Honor members, but I think the other 3 running backs are better. And I think in a couple of years, we'll be talking about Devontae Freeman up in that group. And I'm not even feeling like that's a hot take. Like I feel like Devontae Freeman in, 2020, when he's got 6,000 yards, we're going to be like, yep, that's it. That's the best running back in Falcons history.
Yeah, I think that's that's not a crazy prediction. For me, this is another one. Riggs and Andrews were definitely before my time, but looking up some of their numbers, especially Riggs, like if you look at his peak, and this is sort of how I sort of ordered these guys and how I determined the order. I was trying to look at, okay, whose 3 to 5 year peak was the best. And I think when you go back and you look at that peak in the mid-'80s for Gerald Riggs that came right out on the heels of William Andrews getting hurt, like that 3-year peak, he was one of the best running backs in the league, at least when you compare his stats. He was putting up numbers almost identical to what Walter Payton was putting up at that time. Now, granted, that was Walter Payton towards the end of his career, not necessarily during his prime years. But the fact that you could say that Gerald Riggs from like 1984 to 1986 was like a top 3, top 4 running back in an era that you could certainly say was more of a running back dominated era than necessarily what we have today, I think deserves a claim, not to mention the fact that he's the all-time leading rusher. For me, so I had Riggs 1. I have Turner 2, just because I think you can make a very similar argument about Turner in those first 3 or 4 years when he was in Atlanta, where he was one of the most productive running backs in the league. And he was the guy that sort of really carried that team early on in the career until about 2010, when we started to see Matt Ryan take more of the reins of the offense. Then I had William Andrews. He could be higher on this list just because if he hadn't gotten injured in 1983 or 84 or whenever it was, he could have been the all-time leading rusher. I think he had like a 1,500-yard season back then, which is ridiculous. Considering there haven't been that many Falcon rushers in history that have hit 1,500 yards throughout their career. I had Dunn 4. Love Warrick Dunn. Certainly in terms of all-time players, to rush for 10,000 yards and be, a 5'7", 180-pound running back is an amazing achievement. Respect Warrick Dunn, probably one of the better human beings to ever put on a Falcons uniform as well. So, in terms of who's the best running back to put on a Falcons uniform other than maybe Eric Dickerson, if you're going to throw him in the list, I would certainly agree with you on Warrick Dunn. But just judging on what they did as Falcons, I think he sort of had a couple of good seasons under Mora, and then sort of was a solid piece, but not necessarily an all-timer, just because he wasn't put in a position to tote the rock. Certainly think you can make a case that had he not split time with guys like Duckett and whatnot, and Jarius Norwood later on, he would have been a lot more productive and a lot more capable. I got Jamal at number 5. Jamal's 98 season, at least from my eyes, is the best season a running back has ever had. But unfortunately with Jamal, he was sort of limited early on because he was playing behind Ironhead. And then at the end of his career, he was limited by injury, similar to William Andrews. So peak season, Jamal's number 1 for me. Favorite Falcon running back of all time, Jamal's number 1 for me. But in terms of comparing his career in Atlanta with some of these other guys, I had to put him at number 5. And I agree with you on Devontae. Another year or two, he's in the conversation in this list in terms of being an all-timer for the Falcons.
I can't believe you mentioned Eric Dickerson. You know who had and has more rushing yards in a Falcons uniform than Eric Dickerson?
Matt Ryan?
Well, Matt Ryan's killing them on that. But I'm saying like Jeff George had more rushing yards.
Yeah.
Matt Schaub had more rushing yards. Julio Jones has 94 rushing yards. He had more rushing yards than Eric Dickerson. Harry Douglas only had 20 rushing yards less.
Yeah, I know. He literally had a cup of coffee with the Falcons. Obviously he's a Hall of Famer. That's the only point I was trying to make, is that he's literally probably the best running back that played for the Falcons, but not necessarily comes close to the conversation of actually having a great career in Atlanta.
Matt Ryan has almost as many career rushing yards as Tevin Coleman does.
Oh, okay.
But think about it. Ryan's played a decade. Coleman's played 2 years.
Yeah. I'm hoping Coleman's going to close the gap on that at sometime soon.
No. Coleman has 32 more.
Oh, okay.
Ryan has 880. Coleman has 912.
All right. Well, then he needs to widen the gap. I hope that there's not a footnote on Tevin Coleman's Falcon career that he had just barely more yards career-wise than Matt Ryan. So hopefully,
he should beat Steven Jackson this year, who had 1,250 yards in his 2 years.
There you go. All right, let's talk. We'll have to skip over my favorite position at the fullback, and maybe at a later date we might do top 5 Falcon fullbacks, but that will require a little bit more research. Ovi's number 1, but let's move on to wide receivers.
Justin Griffith, man, Justin Griffith.
Bob Christian number 2, but DeMarco's top 5 as well. Anyway, sorry. Wide receivers. Let's talk about the top 5 Falcon wide receivers. And I think this is an interesting list because I think 1 and 2 are pretty obvious, at least from my perspective. But who you have at 3, 4, 5 could vary depending on the person. For me, 1 and 2 is Roddy number 1, Julio number 2. Probably this time next year, we might be saying Julio number 1, Roddy number 2. But I'll give, Roddy certainly deserves the accolades of being the all-time best wide receiver in Falcons history.
I'm going to flip those and say Julio is the best wide receiver in Falcons history, and he's shown it. He just doesn't have the longevity of Roddy yet, but in 6 years, he's done 75% of what Roddy did in 11. So give him another 2 years and he's caught up. Like, I'm giving Julio Jones a 3-year span to surpass Roddy in pretty much every stat, except for catches. Because for whatever reason, he only gets like 65 catches in a year, but somehow has 1,500 yards.
Okay. He's good. I don't know if people know that. Yeah, I don't. I think Roddy deserves the accolades just because of longevity. I think Julio certainly is the most talented receiver. Certainly his peak is better than any other receivers. But I just need to see, given the injury history, given that he's missed some time, I think in order to get the bump above Roddy, he needs to, put in a little bit more time and work and be a little bit more durable over the next year or two. Again, next year I might be saying Julio's certainly surpassed Roddy at this point, but until that time, Roddy's number one for me. Who do you think is 3, Scott?
Personally, I'm going to go with Terrence Mathis, but that's just because I have all those fond memories of 1998 and the years surrounding 1998. He was the Falcons' number 1 for those years, and I've just always been a fan of his. I think that, he's the true number 3. And if I had to pick a number 4, I'm going with Bad Moon, Andre Rison.
Yeah, I can't argue with that assessment. I was thinking Terrence Mathis, but I started thinking about it a little bit more, and I'm like, well, I do like Terrence Mathis. I think he was great, but he's more up there in my opinion because of longevity, than necessarily that he was better than some of these other guys. I think Rison only played maybe 5 years in Atlanta. But I think he was probably better in those 5 years than Mathis was over any of his 5 years. I also got to give love for Alfred Jenkins. He came a little bit before my time, but I think he did lead the league in receiving yards. In 1981 or 1982, he had 1,300 receiving yards. Was averaging, 19 yards a reception, if I'm not mistaken. So back in that day, receivers didn't really put up numbers like that. It's on average, I think it's teams today complete 9 or 10 more passes per game than teams did, 30, 40 years ago. So it's much easier for receivers to sort of put up monster production. So to be a 1,300-yard receiver, 35-ish years ago is pretty impressive. So I gave Alfred Jenkins the benefit of the doubt. Throw out some love for some of the older heads. I got to represent the 35 and up Falcon fan crowd, I guess. So Alfred Jenkins is number 3 for me. I have Mathis 4 and Rison 5.
I think that's fair. I would personally have it as Mathis, Rison, Jenkins, but I get why you have it the way you have it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the Falcon receivers because, it's because they had a lot of good guys that played for the team in the 90s when they were the run and shoot Falcons. They had guys like Drew Hill and Michael Haynes, Bert Emanuel. And some of these guys, I don't necessarily know if they're top 5 guys, but if someone sort of had them sneaking, guys, particularly Haynes and Emanuel, sneaking into the top 5, I couldn't really disagree with that. So the Falcons have had a history of pretty solid receivers outside of that sort of 5-year period where they just literally couldn't get anybody good for Michael Vick to throw to. But I don't think that was all just because of the receiver quality. I think a lot of that had to do with the quarterback, but that's a conversation for another day. But yeah, generally speaking, the Falcons have had good receivers, particularly in the 80s, 90s, and over the last 5, 6, or 10 years if you count Roddy's prime. All right, let's move on to tight ends. Now, I think this is one that's an interesting list because I think there's three main Falcon tight ends in the history that sort of matter. Then it's just like whatever for 4 and 5, I think. And the order of the top three, I think, is going to, you could figure it out any way you want, and I couldn't really dispute it. But for me, number one is Tony Gonzalez.
Yep, I'll agree there. Number two is your cousin Algie.
Yeah. Yeah. And the interesting thing is like Jim Mitchell for me is number three. And for any of you younger Falcon fans, he played for the Falcons from 1969 to 1979. And at least from a production standpoint, he is the most productive Falcon tight end of all time. But I think a lot of that owes to his longevity. The fact that he played 11 seasons, was a solid to good tight end. And, he was basically the number two receiver for a lot of those years behind guys like Ken Burrows and I don't know, Art Malone or whoever else were some of the early 70s wide receivers. It's maybe a little bit before my time to remember guys on the top of my head. So he was kind of like Algie for his era, but I just think Algie did a little bit more heavy lifting in the offense, at least statistically. Again, I'm not judging off of what I saw because I wasn't alive back then. But it seemed like Algie gets the benefit from me for doing a little bit more heavy lifting and basically being the number one receiver for much of his career, while Mitchell was sort of the number two. Tony's number one for me because he's Tony and he's great. And even though he only played, 5 years in Atlanta, he did more in those 5 years than I think even a guy like Mitchell did in 11. So he's without a doubt the best all-timer. Love you, Algie, but Tony's the only guy in the world that could eclipse you on this list.
I mean, going from Algie Crumpler to Tony Gonzalez was a nice little setup. The fact that the Falcons got Tony Gonzalez when they got him, he was crucial to the development for Matt Ryan throughout the years too. After those three guys, though, like it's Gonzalez, Crumpler, Mitchell, and then after that, like I don't know who else you can really go with. Like Junior Miller, he had a good year. Brian Kozlowski, he was okay. I honestly want to throw Jacob Tamme up there in my top 5 just because that's where we're at. Like Austin Hooper, if he has a legit like 700, 800-yard year this year, he could instantly be in the top 5 Falcons tight ends of all time. Like even if he has a 600-yard year, he could be up there.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, like Junior Miller came right after Jim Mitchell. He had a couple of nice solid years production-wise. But you're right. It's one of those things where I think, at least from a statistical production standpoint, basically if you're the Falcons starting tight end for like 3 seasons, you'll be among their top 5. I have Junior Miller at 4. I have Arthur Cox at 5. It was Mitchell, Miller, Cox all back-to-back from, that was the trend from the late 60s into the late 80s. And those sort of guys succeeded one another there. And but yeah, Austin Hooper, there's a good chance that, after a year or two as a starter, he'll be in the conversation to be in the top 5. And, after 3 or 4 years, certainly will be hands down probably after the big 3, the 4th best tight end of all time, potentially.
I think that's fair. And could potentially get up above Algie one day. I don't think I'll ever rank him above Tony Gonzalez though. Like he could have 8,000 yards in Atlanta over a 10-year span. I'll never rank him above Tony Gonzalez.
Yeah, it's gonna like for Austin Hooper to get there, and this is far, far, far away. He's got to have a career. I'm trying to think, like maybe like Todd Heap. I feel like. Yeah, like he's gonna have to be like, he's gonna be the Falcons tight end for like the next 10 years.
Or like Jason Witten.
Yeah, that's another good example.
Like he needs Witten's like the second best tight end of all time.
Yeah, like I like Austin Hooper, don't get me wrong, but I don't expect him to hit the heights that Tony Gonzalez hit. So I think if he's gonna ever be considered the best tight end to ever play for the Falcons, more than likely it's gonna be due to longevity as opposed to the fact that we're going to look at his career and say, oh, yeah, he was one of the elite tight ends in the league for 5 years, like Tony Gonzalez was, even though Tony Gonzalez was at the end of his career. He was still one of the 4 or 5 best tight ends in the league, even on the decline in his career. And that's a testament to how good a player he was in Kansas City, which was, one of the best all time, first ballot Hall of Famer. If you don't know the legend of Tony Gonzalez, then your ass better call somebody.
That's all right, required reading for NFL fans. You need to know who Tony Gonzalez is.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen, he did a Showtime documentary a couple of years back, which I think is an outstanding watch. If you guys can sort of find it on Amazon or wherever it is, it's definitely worthwhile. It talks about sort of his growing up in California and how his brother was sort of his guide in terms of helping him become a better player, because his brother was a star football player but then got injured or whatnot. So certainly a required viewing if you're a big Tony Gonzalez fan. So we're going to finish off our top 5. We're going to talk offensive line. Instead of just ranking the 5 best offensive linemen, we're going to pick our 5 starting offensive linemen. So we'll just go, left tackle to right tackle. Scott, why don't you start us off?
All right. So left tackle, I think there's only one guy you can put there. He should be on the Hall of Fame. I don't know why he's not. He's like a 4-time Pro Bowler or 4-time All-Pro, like a 5 or 6-time Pro Bowler. Mike Ken, instantly to me, is that left tackle. He was the best left tackle in the 80s, period. End of story. Like, no matter what team, he was the best left tackle. There are people that have gone on and been like, hey, you know how you talk about Jonathan Ogden and all these other guys? You've got to put Mike Ken up there if you're putting Jonathan Ogden up there.
Fair enough. Yeah, Mike Ken is, if we're talking Hall of Fame snubs, he's got to be number 1 on the Falcons list. I know Tommy Nobis is an all-timer for the Falcons as well, and certainly underrated for his era. But Mike Ken, in terms of the longevity, he played 17 seasons in the NFL. I don't know how many starts he missed, but I don't think it was many. Multi-Pro Bowler, one of the greats, but is overlooked because of the Falcons' sort of historic sort of malaise, I guess you would call it. Talking about guys like Gerald Riggs and William Andrews, their success in the 80s, I think a lot of it has to do with playing behind some really good offensive lines. And about, at least for me, 4/5 of my, top 5 starting line are going to be guys that play for the team in the 80s. So Mike Ken is the left tackle for me. And, he's just starting off. Who you got next playing beside him, Scott?
See, left guard's tough because, a lot of people would want to say R.C. Thielman or someone like that. I'm going to go with someone more recent. I think Justin Blaylock.
I figured you would go with Justin Blaylock.
I think with someone like Justin Blaylock, he's a good power run blocker, and he's just a good, solid pass blocker. He may allow 2 sacks a year every year. It's going to happen, but he's consistent. He'll allow those 2, and then he won't allow anything else. He's going to allow a couple pressures here and there, but, he's Blaylock. You know what you're getting. He's consistent. He's reliable. He's going to miss 1 game every 3rd year, and then you're good.
Look, I think, I got R.C. Thielman, and it's only because it's kind of a cheat because he spent most of his career playing right guard, but he did switch over to left guard towards the end of his stint in Atlanta and made a Pro Bowl, I think, in 82 or 83 or something like that. And so that's something that Justin Blaylock never did. But I can't blame you for putting Justin Blaylock there because as far as the best pure left guard to play for Atlanta, it's probably going to be Justin Blaylock. I think Blaylock was never sort of a great offensive lineman, but I think for most of his career, he was solid. Yeah, like it's one of those things where like for me, I like Justin Blaylock. I think he played at a reasonably high level for a pretty long time, but it's hard for me to put him on the all-time list because I think he would sort of stand out as not one of the better offensive linemen. And so having a guy like R.C. Thielemann, who went to like 3 or 4 Pro Bowls in Atlanta and was one of those 80s offensive linemen, wound up going to Washington and being one of the Hogs on their Super Bowl winning team in the late 80s. He's got the pedigree, so I'm going to go with him as my left guard.
Fair enough.
I'm curious if you're going to go, who you're going to pick at center. You can go old school or you can go new school.
This is another case where everybody wants to tell me about this great football player